Russian President Vladimir Putin is sending tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. Putin says the move is a warning to the West as it steps up military support for Ukraine. He maintains the Belarus leader Alexander Lukashenko has been asking for nuclear weapons to be stationed there for years. Belarus borders Ukraine as well as NATO members Poland, Lithuania and Latvia. Again, Putin insists Lukashenko welcomes Moscow's move.
Alexander Lukashenko is right. He says we are your closest allies. Why are the Americans helping their allies deploy on their territory, train their pilots to use this kind of weapons if necessary? We have agreed that we will do the same without violating our obligations. I want to stress this, without violating our non-proliferation obligations.
And for more, I'm joined by Marina Miron. She's joining now from the Munich, and she's, of course, a research fellow at King's College London. Good to have you with us. So Putin himself saying that this move is a warning to the West. Is Putin's decision likely to escalate tensions with NATO?
Thank you for having me. Well, it is an interesting question because the problem is that last year, Russia was trying to compel Ukraine not to join NATO without using force, and that compellence failed. After that, Putin has threatened with his nuclear arsenal, so there was nuclear saber rattling. And every single time that Western countries offered support to Ukraine, Putin would use a nuclear rhetoric. And so at a certain point, this nuclear rhetoric has lost its deterrent power. So I think Putin was looking for a way to restore the credibility of the Russian nuclear deterrent. And that is essentially what we're seeing with this move, because the next best move would be to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, which would be detrimental not only for Ukraine, but also for Russia. And I think the Russian leadership understands that.
Now, we're talking about tactical nuclear weapons. What exactly are we talking about here?
Well, the warheads are much smaller for tactical nuclear weapons, and they can cause a lot of damage. However, you can achieve that same effect using non-nuclear warheads. Therefore, it's much smaller evil, despite the fact that we're talking about nuclear weapons. That being said, it would have environmental damage, and therefore it wouldn't benefit Russia by any means using those in Ukraine, because the forces would have to offer wear protective suits in order to operate in those territories where these tactical nuclear weapons would be used. So it doesn't make any sense to create wasteland in Ukraine for Putin, because he's essentially seeking to control those territories himself. Therefore, there is no reasonable logic to do so. It is more of a symbolic deterrent to NATO as a result of, for instance, the UK's declaration to ship depleted uranium rounds to Ukraine. So it is a bit of a quid pro quo what we're seeing here, because in a diplomatic sphere and in a deterrent sphere, Putin is running out of options. So something needs to be done without escalating to the use of these weapons.
Yeah. Where does this leave Belarus? Because Putin also keeps stressing the fact that Lukashenko actually asked for it and wants it.
Well, the problem is that something that we see on the news and all those official declarations made by Lukashenko are one thing. The other thing we have to keep in mind is that Lukashenko depends on Russia. He has close security ties with Russia. On the other hand, he cannot afford to be drawn into this war. So he is trying to find a sort of an equilibrium, not upsetting Kremlin and at the same time not getting drawn into the war. And I think a key moment here is that Moscow will retain control over those tactical nuclear weapons, and therefore Belarus doesn't have a lot of say in terms of when and how they would potentially be used.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Marina Miron, research fellow at King's College London, joining us today from Munich. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm joined now by Susie Snyder. She is the program coordinator at the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. So welcome to DW. Good to have you with us. So do you think that this move makes it more likely Russia might use nuclear weapons in the war against Ukraine?
What we have seen for over a year is the constant threat of use of nuclear weapons by Putin in his illegal invasion in Ukraine. And every time this threat happens, it is met with global condemnation, which is the correct response. This move now is a continued escalation, and it does increase risk. And that is a risk that is not limited to the countries involved in the conflict, but is a global risk, as any use of nuclear weapons does have potentially global catastrophic consequences.
So what would those risks look like? I mean, Russia, for example, already has nuclear weapons stationed in the region. So in your view, does this latest move perhaps affect security in Europe?
Well, what it does is it sends an escalatory message, and it demonstrates a willingness to potentially employ nuclear weapons, which is a taboo. It's a line that we haven't seen crossed in over 75 years. And the use of nuclear weapons, it would be a threat to all of Europe and to the rest of the world. Even the use of a fraction of today's arsenals, less than 10% of what is currently in the possession of Russia or the US, less than 10% would cause a global catastrophic climate emergency, sending the world into a potential famine that could affect the lives of 2 billion individuals. Now, every escalatory measure is often met with a similar response. And our best move right now is to de-escalate the situation and condemn this type of behavior. There is a treaty that makes the deployment of weapons into another's territory illegal. And it's the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
Right.
And so countries who are concerned and want to prevent this type of activity, prevent this escalation, have an option. They have a legal option they can go ahead with.
Having said that, and knowing that if Vladimir Putin decided to use nuclear weapons, he surely knows that there would be retaliation. So it isn't a win-win situation. So perhaps he's after something else, in which case, what is Vladimir Putin trying to achieve by sending tactical nuclear warheads to Belarus?
I cannot claim to be in the mind of Vladimir Putin, and neither can anyone else. And that is part of the problem here, that in order that the system that we have employed for decades, where one country is supposedly deterring another country's nuclear weapons by their own, or by sharing nuclear arsenals, as Putin is now attempting to do, that system requires you to be in the mind of your adversary. And that's something I don't think anybody can claim a right to do or be accurate with. So it sends a message that these weapons are potentially useful in the conflict, and that an escalation is not seen as highly problematic. And yet we all know that it is, and that this is an action that must be condemned.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Susie Snyder from the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Thank you so much for your time.